I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Lee, introduce our guest for today.
Well, his name is Nick Stember. He is the translator for a pretty famous contemporary short story novelist, Jia Pingwa.
Among other things.
Among other things. He's an incredible person, very handsome, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
We're interviewing him over Skype today, although we got the chance to actually talk with him when he stopped by the U of O campus a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yep, and we're going to be shamelessly plugging at least a pair of websites that Nick helms, one of which is actually on Chinese manga.
Yeah.
Which is
an amazing website.
It's fascinating.
What's the name of that website, Nick?
Well, the name of the website is just nickstemper.com. But
so an easy one.
Yeah, it's an easy one. But I guess the technical name I use for it is the Encyclopedia Manjuarica.
Okay.
So.
And we'll put links to these up on the podcast site. So.
Yeah.
And then his second website, of course, deals with the Chinese writer Jia Pingwa.
Right.
So, Nick, tell us a little bit about what you do with Jia Pingwa and who Jia Pingwa is.
So Jia Pingwa is he's an author of contemporary Chinese fiction. He was born in the 1950s in China, mainland China. And he was born in kind of rural Shaanxi province. So Shaanxi province is one of the more kind of out-of-the-way corners of China now. But, of course, traditionally it was the Chinese homeland. And Jia Pingwa, he writes what would be considered rural fiction. So a lot of his stories deal with characters from the countryside who have come to the city, or often just characters in the countryside and their experience of different historical events in China. So my work with Jia Pingwa, I met him in March 2016 for the first time, and I gave a talk in Xi'an on translating literature, so about my experience of bringing Chinese literature into English, mostly comics, but also science fiction. And so when I was when I was talking to Jia, I was kind of giving him some of my ideas about how we could present more of his literature, bring more of his work into English. So that's kind of how we got started. And then through that kind of partnership, we launched this project to translate some of his novels, or translate samples of his novels, called the Ugly Stone Project.
Which is, of course, also, we'll get to this in a second, the title of the story we'll be talking about today. Lee and I think this is true for you, tell me if this is wrong, Lee, but Lee and I had not actually read Jia Pingwa until we met Nick.
Yeah, I had vaguely heard about him. I mean, I don't do contemporary stuff as much as you do, Rob, but he is very... Well, tell me, Nick, how big is Jia Pingwa in kind of contemporary Chinese literature?
Well, I'd say Jia Pingwa, he's one of the top writers definitely in China today, one of the most well-known authors of Chinese literature among Chinese readers.
Okay.
But I think for people who are reading Chinese literature in translation, they're not as familiar with his work because very few of his novels have actually been translated into English.
Yep.
So far he's only had 2 books that are available in English right now.
And those are what?
The first... go ahead.
No, I was going to say, though, those were what? Tell us the titles.
So the first one was Turbulence, which was, I think, came out in 1992. The translation was a book that he had written, Fu Zao is the Chinese title of the book, and that was, I believe, 89 is when it came out in Chinese, and that was translated by Howard Goldblatt. And then his latest book that came out was actually published in 1992 in Chinese, Feidu, or Abandoned Capital, as it's often known. Now, the most recent translation is Ruined City is the title that they use. But it's also translated by Howard Goldblatt, and that just came out last year in January 2016 with Oklahoma University Press.
And that's his that's his most famous book in China, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ruined City is definitely his most famous book in China, mostly because there's a lot of controversy around the book. It was banned for obscenity, essentially. I think it was actually a couple months after the book came out, it was banned.
We should point out it's banned for obscenity, but it's also based off of a very classical book that we'd like to talk more about eventually, the Jin Ping Mei, The Plum in the Golden Vase. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's arguable about how much he drew from this book. But when I met with him actually in last year, so that was one of the first things I asked him about. It's like, hey, did you read Jin Ping Mei? I said, oh yeah, I read this in back in like the late 70s when it was still kind of verboten in China, and I got like this a bootleg copy of the book.
It's still kind of verboten in China, sort of, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still not something that's super accessible, and I know. From studying it at UBC, so when I took a course in the Jin Ping Mei with Catherine Swanek, she was talking about how there's certain versions of the book that are very hard to get a hold of in China. So certain of there's like redacted versions that are available, but then some of the more explicit versions are harder to find.
Yeah. It would be like trying to get a hold of, say, a proper copy of the Decameron to teach. You don't find a lot of lit classes, say, for undergrads and below, that teach the Decameron, because that would just be impossible.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, so he's one of the top, Jia Pingwa is one of the top writers in contemporary Chinese literature. But when I think of the top, most famous guy, I always think of Mo Yan. And you mentioned that Jia Pingwa is considered a writer of rural fiction. Mo Yan is also a writer of rural fiction, but there are a lot of differences, and I was wondering if you could kind of compare and contrast the two for us.
So, if you're going to compare Mo Yan to the Jia Pingwa, which I think is something that a lot of readers in English are going to do, because obviously Mo Yan is the most well-known Chinese author, having won the Nobel Prize, and also Mo Yan is kind of famous for being this rural author. Kind of that same mold as Jia Pingwa and some other authors from this time period. But I think the big difference between Mo Yan and Jia Pingwa is that Jia Pingwa was, first of all, I think he's actually from the countryside, whereas Mo Yan is not. Mo Yan was sent down. So I think in a way, Jia Pingwa, he comes to, you could say he comes by it more honestly.
Could we say that?
Mo Yan is kind of.
Could we say that? Mo Yan is a bit of a rural writer poser.
I don't know if I go quite so far as saying that he's a poser, but I think that Mo Yan, he's definitely trying for a certain effect. So he's trying to create this idea of kind of an idealized version of rural society.
Okay.
Whereas I think Jia Pingwa, in a sense, I think he's more relying on his own experiences, and I think also Jia Pingwa. What's really interesting about him is that his father was actually a school teacher. So Jia Pingwa had, a very strong foundation in the classics from a pretty young age. So I think when we look at some of Jia Pingwa's writing, you can see a lot of connections to earlier styles of Chinese writing. So especially like Story of the Stone,
right?
Or
Jin Ping Mei,
as it's known,
yeah. Or
Jin Ping Mei. So like this Ming and Qing vernacular fiction, I think a lot of that stuff crops up in Jia Pingwa's writing. So even though he's writing about a contemporary period, he's using these older forms in a way that I think very few authors in China today are able to do.
So let's go ahead and dive into the story that we had on tap for today, because I think that'll give people a better idea, a little more concrete idea of what we're talking about. The story is called The Ugly Stone. The basic shell of the plot, and I'm really only going to give the shell of the plot.
It's a fairly short story.
It's a very short story. Is set in a village where there's, an ugly stone that sits outside of a house, and it's first-person narrative. The writer reflects on how ugly it is. No one knows why it's there, what it's for.
It doesn't really have any uses.
Doesn't seem to have any uses except that there's a little divot on top that collects rainwater, and the chickens drink out of it. So people make fun of it. No one can seem to figure out what to do with it. And one day, a passerby they've never seen before stops in his tracks, stares at it, and proceeds to take up residence in the village and investigate it. And it turns out that what we're looking at is not just an ugly stone, but a piece of a meteorite.
And that stranger is not just any person, it's an astronomer, right?
Yes, we figure out by the end he's an astronomer. And the story ends with the narrator reflecting on how fascinating it is that this piece of a meteorite that is essentially a ball of fire streaking across the sky, across the universe, ends up at his doorstep.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the contrasts that he puts up is, he's just in this kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but kind of backwoods rural village, and this rock was once kind of soaring around through outer space, and kind of contrast in the distance, I guess.
Yeah. So when Lee and I read this, I was really struck by it. I had not actually read Jia Pingwa before this story, and when I first started, I had literally knew nothing about their author. I didn't Wikipedia him, Google him, nothing. And I started off thinking it was a much older story because of its concision, because of how simply it's narrated. But it very quickly became clear that it's a very modern story, the way that the author is reflecting on what's happening. But I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts when you were reading it, maybe for the first time. Nick's obviously read it much more than we have, but...
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it definitely didn't seem like anything that I had read in contemporary Chinese fiction. It was not concerned with... There was no political overtones whatsoever, and I'm oftentimes used to... I mean, when I read Mo Yan, oftentimes he'll write about kind of historical matters. I'm particularly thinking of Red Sorghum, where there's always something... related to a political matter, even if his writing is not necessarily, even if that specific piece is not necessarily all that political.
Yeah, a lot of quote-unquote rural writers tend to sort of put their political concerns front and center.
Yeah. I guess, Nick, let me ask you, so did you find this to be, do you find Jia Pingwa and this particular story to overall be fairly lacking any kind of political flavor?
Well, I think it's tricky when you talk about lacking political flavor because, I mean, obviously any political, like even the absence of politics is a political position,
sure.
Right? And so, I think that Jia Pingwa, I would say he avoids talking about things directly. He doesn't tend to include a lot of things like this was the first year of the Great Leap Forward, or this was the first year of the Cultural Revolution, or something like that. He does have stories and novels that are set in those time periods, and obviously they had they would have some sort of effect on his growing up, and he's written about them in his nonfiction. So he's actually it's one kind of interesting thing that also ties him, I think, to earlier Chinese authors. Is he's better known for a lot of people. He's better known for his nonfiction than he is for his fiction. So his short essays, his Sanwen, are really famous. So he has like a collection of Sanwen that's actually like a bestseller right now in China.
Okay.
But I think this story is an example of kind of one of these stories. It's not exactly a fictional story, not exactly a Sanwen. It's kind of some sort of like a hybrid in between the two.
You said it's not like it's sort of a hybrid between the two, between fiction and Sanwen. Sanwen, I guess we should translate. That's essay, right?
More or less,
right?
Yeah.
Like a casual essay.
Yeah.
But I don't know. When I was reading this, I felt like there was a lot of kind of autobiographical flavor to the story. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's kind of that's what I would argue is the takeaway from the story, right? Is that Jia Pingwa is trying to compare himself to this ugly stone. So the thing that I thought that was really interesting, I know that you guys kind of really saw a lot in this kind of significance of the fact that it was this otherworldly object that came to a rural village.
Yeah.
But the thing that really struck me about this story is the fact that the stone is so useless. That the stone is, and even the title of the story, right? Ugly Stone. Yeah. It's a story about an object that's almost, there's an element of revulsion, that they want to get rid of this thing, that it's not even something that anybody wants to have around. So I think in a way, the Jia Pingwa's politics, I would kind of argue that his politics are on a very personal level. And he likes to talk about his position in society and the position of kind of the rural other in urban China today.
And it's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned that because I think this is something that struck me about Jia Pingwa, this particular story anyway, and that I do notice about certain other rural writers who, as you say, actually do come from the countryside. There's less interest in foregrounding sort of obviously political interest, and a lot more interest in exploring personal reflection. So in this one, for example, it doesn't matter so much to Jia Pingwa where this village is, how poor it is, did the events occurred in the Great Leap Forward or anything like that. What's important is what people make of this stone and what the narrator makes of it in turn. So one of the things I enjoyed in the story was the fact that the people in the village are just people in a village. They're not backwards or they're not noble. They're just folk. And they don't like this rock. We probably wouldn't like it either if we didn't know what it was. Yeah. And that's the story. And I find that in some ways one of the most political aspects of it, because when in the Maoist era in China, when the soldier, the farmer, the worker are being put forth as sort of the archetypal literary figures and subjects, this is a response with none of those. It's just a person.
I think we talked about in our Zhang Ailing podcast how not talking about politics is a very political act, and I think you and Nick have both brought that up, and I think now I'm seeing it more. Nick, can I ask you, so you said that you thought that Jia Pingwa identified very heavily with the stone. Is that correct?
That was my reading of the story. Obviously, he may have a different reading of the story, but that's what I would assume he's writing about.
So I had a question when I was reading it. I was thinking I was reading it more as not that he's identifying with the stone, but I mean, you talked about how he grew up in this very rural environment, but his father was a teacher, so he was incredibly well educated in the Chinese classics. And I was thinking that the Chinese classics might actually be what the stone represented, this kind of otherworldly, beautiful thing that just comes out of nowhere. Do you think that's valid?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a valid point where you could say that the stone is because the same thing I think with the classics is people grew up with these stories. It's not like they don't know about them, but I think it's harder for people to appreciate them in China because usually their experience with the classics is through like some sort of like a TV series or something like that where it's very much it's mediated by all these layers of interpretation.
And it's interesting.
Very few.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think very few Chinese readers today, or very few people have the opportunity to actually experience these texts firsthand.
And it's interesting because we're making a distinction here. Is it the writer or is it the classics? But the two are really linked because if Jia Pingwa is primarily concerned about the peculiarity of something in the kinds of places he grew up, then the classics, scholarship, writing novels, all of these are going to be seen in a similar way. They're not particularly useful, right? And it's not that far from where we are even in the United States. I think about telling people what I do, getting a PhD in comparative literature, doing things with modern Chinese literature, and a lot of people, their eyes just glaze over. Like, why would you do that? What is the point of that, So I kind of identify with this notion of this stone that maybe it's magnificent, but only if you know exactly what it is. If you don't, it's just a thing,
I guess, and I think I brought this up when we discussed it last time. One of the things that I liked about this is the astronomer who comes out. He's this educated guy, but in Chinese, the word astronomer is 天文学家, so that literally means like guy who studies the writing of heaven, something like that. And it's very similar to a person who studies literature, which is just 文学家. I don't want to make too much of that, but I guess that was kind of one of the things that kind of spurred me to that reading.
Yeah.
Right. And another interesting kind of tie into that is also the idea that in Chinese, in English we say it's all Greek to me. In most languages we say it's all Chinese to me. But in Chinese you say it's all 天文, right? It's all like heavenly writing.
That's a good point. Yeah. And, there are people who will spend their lives studying the Tianwen. The astronomer in the story does. You could argue Jia Pingwa does because he's writing these stories, but he's also engaging in a level of inquiry that no one he grew up with will likely ever even be interested in. And so you can understand why he would pen a story in which the central thing is not only ugly, but can't even speak. It's just a thing.
Yeah, it gathers some water.
It gathers water, and that's the only time it's actually useful. Is the chickens are like, sweet, a place to drink,
Did either of you find some sort of connection to Story of the Stone with the detail with the water?
I had thought about it, but I wasn't sure how much to make of it. I mean, the story of the stone is this magnificent and magnificently long 100-chapter book. I do think that there is something going on. I mean, not only a story of the stone, which also translated Dream of the Red Chamber, but also you've got, the Journey to the West. Monkey is he comes out of a stone. There's all this kind of weird stuff going on with stones in Chinese literature. We talked about it a little in our Pusong Ling podcast on the love of a man and his stone. I don't know. I guess I didn't necessarily connect it with the story of the stone. I was just kind of putting this story in the genre of Chinese stories about stones.
Yeah. So, Nick, what did you see a connection with the story of the stone?
Well, I just remember from reading the first chapter of the story of the stone, which is kind of a surprising chapter if you're reading about the book from another somebody recommends the book to you and say, oh, what's it about? It's about this family, and they go through all these different convolutions, and it's kind of like a Chinese 100 Years of Solitude or something.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is actually that first chapter of the book and the last chapter of the book are these very otherworldly chapters, and there are other chapters, other kind of segments in the book that take place in like a fairyland.
Yeah, right? That whole
first chapter.
That whole first chapter is pretty mythological, right?
Right. Yeah, it seems very, very mythological. It seems like kind of almost like the beginning to Journey to the West, right? The same kind of thing where this monkey comes out of a stone.
Yeah.
So in Story of the Stone, it's a boy who is actually a stone reborn, right? And then he's got this connection to the Daju, who was this flower that watered him with her sweet dew, or he watered the flower. I don't remember exactly the relationship, but there was some sort of relationship. They were taking care of each other in the previous life, and then they're reborn, and so he has to repay her.
So one of the things that it's interesting with Jia Pingwa's story is that he seems to sort of pose the question: what if the stone was just a stone? What if it was just a hunk of rock, and no one even knew what it was? It was just a rock, and it only becomes not a rock when someone is around who has a perspective that no one else has. So this isn't just a tale of a magnificent rock and no one knows what it is. It's also the tale of the necessity of having a certain kind of perspective to know it's not a rock.
If I could say, a certain kind of reading or a certain ability to read. Yeah.
And it's a lonely one. I mean, the person is wandering through town. Who knows why he's there? But both the astronomer and the rock have skills, have perspectives that the people in the rest of the story do not have. And at least from what we can tell from what's narrated, don't particularly even want to have. And so that seems to me very different than most of the other Romance of Three Kingdoms, but Journey to the West, Story of the Stone. The stone is clearly mythological and imbued with this power or mysticism. Here, it's just a stone.
Right. Well, but there's an interesting suggestion, right, in the story where they load the stone onto the truck and they take it, I guess, presumably to some place where other people will appreciate the stone, right?
Yeah.
So they're taking it out of this rural village and then they're bringing it to, I would presume, to the city.
Some sort of museum
where it's going to,
right,
it's going to sit in a museum somewhere, and people are going to appreciate the stone not as an ugly stone, but they're going to say, "Oh my God, this is a meteorite! This is an amazing thing that we should study and we should learn more about."
But left hanging, and I agree because it's an object of aesthetic splendor now. But left hanging is everyone else in the story, because people may go to this museum and admire it, but the villagers are still going to go, right? But all it really ever did for anyone is gather water for the chickens. So. Enjoy it if you want, but it's really still kind of useless.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could kind of conclude on that, or on a quick question. Like, what is the point of usefulness? Is it good? Is it a good thing to be useful in this story? This is a very Taoist question coming from Zhuangzi. What do you think, Nick?
Is it good to be useful?
Is it good to be?
I remember
in the story.
In this story, well, that is a good question, right? Because in the story, being as long as he was useless, nobody really bothered him, right? As long as he was useless, the stone could just stay there and just be in the village, and nobody really made a use of him. Nobody appreciated it, but also nobody moved him.
Right.
But
True.
then as soon as the stone is recognized for what it is, it gets uprooted and gets taken into a new environment, which may or may not be a better environment for the stone to be in. So
to be put on display, it seems kind of actually worse to be useful or to have your greatness recognized.
Right. So I think there definitely might be a commentary there on that. It's a very old Chinese idea, though, is like the idea of being a hermit or a Taoist philosopher. Is that it's better to be kind of a hermit in the mountains than it is to be recognized and then have your talent abused by a wicked leader or a despot.
I agree. So I'm going to let Nick conclude with that thought. All I was going to say about the story is that we've had a good discussion about it, and you can have many more discussions about it. But if you're the sort of reader who's just encountering some of these things for the first time, just read and enjoy the story.
And I think we're going to put a link to it, to your site, onto the podcast where they will be able to read it. Is that correct, Nick?
Yeah, so we've got a translation up by Eileen and Xian Yang, who are two very famous translators who translate a lot of Chinese fiction. Actually translated Story of the Stone and some other really famous books. So we have a translation up on the Ugly Stone website that's available for anybody to download and read and share. Please do. And I also have a post that just went live today, actually, on Jia Pingwa, and it kind of summarizes all of his books. So this is available on the Global Literature in Libraries Initiative website, so we can put a link to that also on the podcast.
Yeah, we'll put links to nickstember.com, The Ugly Stone, and then the website Nick just mentioned for anyone who's interested in more of this stuff, as you should be.
Is there anything else you want to say, Nick?
No, I just want to thank you guys for bringing me on again. I'm glad it worked out this time.
Yeah, hey, it's
I look forward to.
Yeah, it's really cool to have I guess a colleague essentially in Chinese literature podcasting. Yeah, well, it's fun to get my start here, and I'm looking forward to working with you guys more on more stories. Yeah, cool. All right, well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And Nick
Stember.
Okay. And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.